Welcome, everybody, to this episode of O365Eh. So on today's episode, we're going to be talking about Teams shared calling with special guest, not Michael Lamontagne, who's an expert in Teams shared calling. So we're going to introduce shared calling, tell you what it is, and then walk through a demo of it. So let's start off with the basics. When was shared calling actually GA'd? I think it was, 2 months ago?
Yeah, it was announced for preview in July for Inspire this year, and then it went GA or general available in September of 2023.
Right. So at a super high level, let's talk about the feature capabilities it enables. For those familiar with PSTN usage calling, if you have organizations who don't have heavy usage of PSTN, it might make sense to implement this because basically it greatly simplifies phone number management. It also reduces costs for your organization because you don't need a dedicated number for each user, right? Right, Michael?
Yeah, I think this is like you said, a scenario where you want to enable your users for Teams Phone, but you may not need to give them direct numbers. So you don't need them to be able to receive direct inbound calls via phone number and provisioning all these additional numbers. Things like, I think of like in the education system, classroom phones. You can use it to call out, use it for calling emergencies. But for inbound calling, as a known object within your tenant, you can call it. But as an external user, you don't want people, kind of calling into the classrooms and stuff like that.
And I was just reading about how it's implemented. So it looks like there's an auto attendant involved, so that when a incoming PSTN call comes into a user, shared calling receives the inbound call, then connects to the auto attendant, right?
Yeah, so it's basically tied to the number you're going to use as kind of the number for calling out is tied to a resource account. That resource account can be tied to an auto attendant or a call queue or something like that for the inbound call. So typically we'd see this tied to like an auto attendant because you could do like a dial by name directory. So now if you did want to allow like an inbound call to Hab, you can call in and it hits the directory and then you can say Hab and then that call can get to Hab, even though you don't have a direct number for calling Hab directly.
Right. And then any conversation about calling wouldn't be complete without talking about licensing. I guess each user who participates in shared calling still requires appropriate licensing for calling, right? Like it doesn't really reduce your number of licenses.
Well, it does, depending on how you're using your PSTN or calling service. Because if you think about it, the user just needs Teams Phone, right, which is included, say, an E5 or an add-on. The services for, say, calling out calling plans, that's licensed really to the resource account. Same with like Operator Connect and direct routing. It's really tied to that outbound call that is tied to that resource account. So if you were, depending on how you're doing your licensing model with whatever provider, if you're only having one number, you're not paying for thousands of numbers for limited inbound usage.
Okay, so in the case of calling plans, it goes to that resource account, and then it truly is shared. Okay,
that's great. Yeah, so I can maybe show what it looks like from a configuration, and we can jump into a demo. So let me share my screen. And so full caveat, so this screenshot has been shown at Inspire as well as, and hopefully it's showing, it's been shown at Expire and Ignite just in the last couple of weeks. This is not available today. So there is no way to configure shared calling at this point within the Teams Admin Center. In concept, this covers all the pieces that you'd have to do through PowerShell today. So eventually, I'm sure this Admin Center, since they've already have mock-ups of it and they're already posting it, will be available. But right now, this isn't. So if you think about the components that we're dealing with, we have the resource account, we have some policies, and then we have the users that are consuming it. I think what we missed kind of talking about this at the start is the critical benefit that this shared calling provides over, say, the traditional extension dialing in kind of legacy phone system or PBX system, is that you can make an outbound emergency call and the external PSAP or public services to call back or have the ability to call back directly to that user. So we'll talk about how this works, but in a traditional extension world, you'd call out and the PSAP couldn't call back to you because you were an extension off a main line. So it'd be the main line only. So there was things like ELINs and different numbers to kind of call back into like dispatch and stuff like this. But this actually has some pretty interesting functionality where you can have a pool of emergency numbers, and then basically someone that places an emergency call, they kind of check out one of those numbers for 60 minutes. And so for 60 minutes, there's callback functionality for that emergency call service. Obviously, if your pool is too small, the numbers will rotate. So if in an hour period you have 5 people call emergency services, but only 4 numbers in your pool, that 5th call is going to use the first number in the pool again. So some things to plan around. Think of, the emergency pool of numbers as almost like channels for emergency calling. So, hey, it is not concurrent at a moment, but it is concurrent over 60 minutes. So over that 60 minutes, plan how large of a pool you need to handle kind of your worst day scenario of how many emergency calls would place over that 60-minute period. Okay. So the configuration is, if we think about it from shared calling, we need the latest version of PowerShell, so it isn't in the Teams admin center today. Microsoft kind of documents 5.5 as the version you need as a minimum. Definitely recommend, I think 5.8's out now. Go to the latest because there's other queries that you may do that you had to wait for a newer module to have that. So like querying the online users, they're showing that who has that policy configured, that shared calling policy. That wasn't available in 5.5. It is now available in 5.7, 5.8. So make sure you're always using the latest PowerShell module. We talked about a licensing point of view. You need Teams Phone on all your users, so that's an E5 or add-on. Even though you can have any PSTN option configured in your tenant, you can have calling plans, direct routing, operator connect, multiple different providers. When you configure shared calling, the whole configuration of shared calling for the group of users that are going to be using it has to be on the same PSTN type. So if you're going to use a resource account that's tied to a calling plan number, that is going to be the shared calling number. The emergency numbers should be calling plan numbers. The users that are going to be making the service are going to be using the calling plan as well. So same with operator connect, direct routing, end-to-end configuration of shared calling for that group of users has to stay within the same service. And I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, I was just wondering, with this shared calling, do you still have the ability to have your own number and select it when you make a call out? So it's strictly all or nothing kind of thing, right?
Yeah. So you have users that have direct numbers within the tenant, but if you're configured for share calling as an individual, you're using a resource account number as your number. You don't really have your own number, and when you place calls, you're representing that number. So there isn't a switching of like, oh, I have a direct number, and then I can mask out as another number. That'd be used like if in call queues where we have the outbound caller ID feature or the calling line identity policy to override caller ID. Okay. Other things to note, if you're using calling plans, you have to use the pay-as-you-go plan. So that's the plan that allows unlimited inbound, but you pay for use on the outbound. And so that does mean that you need either communication credits or NCE, new commerce experience, to pay for that outbound minutes, pay for those outbound minutes. With the NCE plan, you have to make sure you enable overages on the licenses so that it does allow that billing mechanism. Otherwise, this won't work. Another thing to note is if you do have a tenant that has direct routing in place, if you are defining network topology for dynamic addresses or emergency policies, there is a risk with this if you were, say, using shared calling with calling plans. When you are at a location, the emergency calling policy from a location is going to be applied to that user, and that might route your emergency call out, the direct routing service versus your calling plan service. So you need to make sure, you have an understanding of what's existing in the tenant and the ramifications of depending on what service you're using with shared calling. The resource account needs to be licensed for the team's resource account license, which is a $0 license, and then configured for whatever PSTN option you're using. So if that is calling plans, if it's grabbing a number from Operator Connect and having that Operator Connect agreement, or using direct routing. As we mentioned before, the inbound call isn't going to get back to the user unless it's an emergency call. So we need to tie, the phone number that everyone's going to be using in shared calling to an auto tenant or a resource account or a call queue, so that maybe you need to do dial by name directory, maybe you need to scope it. So making sure you have an understanding of how that inbound call will come when it's not an emergency scenario. Go ahead.
Yeah. So around the emergency calling, does it allow for the integration with third-party emergency calling providers?
Yeah, so if you're leveraging like calling plans or Operator Connect, you're going to use whatever emergency services are tied to that, which support dynamic address if you're in the US, or what your regulatory requirements would be. For direct routing, of course, you're basically using a voice routing policy that's applied to the resource account. So whatever policy is applied to that, from a path to the PSTN, or hey, we dial 911 and we use this different SBC or this different trunk, that's all supported with this scenario. But the routing happens at the resource account point. Make sure you're not also applying voice routing policies to users. You want to make sure that the shared calling policy is kind of end-to-end, working around the resource account and not conflicting policies on a per user basis. Other key things you need the emergency number pool. So as I was mentioning, you have a number tied to a resource account. That's great for outbound calling. The inbound comes to an auto tenant or call queue. But if you place an emergency call, you want to make sure you're meeting regulatory requirements of like, hey, that emergency service being able to call the person back. That's when you're going to have a pool of numbers that are just used during that time. And that would be, making sure that the pool of numbers is large enough to support your scenario, so that there isn't rolling over the numbers. So the other thing to note is all these numbers need to be tied to emergency addresses, even direct routing numbers. So we'll go through that on the PowerShell side, because that is the static address that will be provided to the emergency services, unless dynamic address location is being in place. And then all the voice users, because we need that phone system license, we do need to enterprise voice enable them, but they won't be getting their own line URI. They'll be using a shared calling policy. Go ahead, Matt. Dino.
Yeah, I was gonna say, in terms of the emergency address. So if you're a simple customer looking to do this, which I think this where it'll fit in, like say for example, a small business or a school. Maybe a school, not so much as a good example, but some organization that has maybe multiple locations but wants to put this behind one auto attendant. And of course, if it's one auto attendant, maybe they have multiple locations. How do you deal with that where you have 3 different offices? You want to front it all with one auto attendant. Maybe talk a little bit about that. Yeah,
so the features that Teams has built around dynamic address detection when you place an emergency call still apply. So I'm a user and I'm on Office A and I place an emergency call. My network configuration will detect that I'm at Office A and pass that as part of the call, even though I'm using a number from the emergency pool as my phone number. But it is at the endpoint that places the call is what's providing that dynamic address. If no dynamic address is provided, then it's going to use the registered address of the phone number tied to the resource account or the emergency pool.
Right. So if we're in Canada, that obviously opens up a different thing because we don't support, Teams, it's not Teams, it's one of the carriers don't support it. So you may have to be careful there.
So it'd be no different than a registered DID. You have a phone number that's tied to a specific location documented to the carrier. You place a call, you might be somewhere else. The clearing center will answer the call and say, hey, we have this registered address. Are you at that address? And if you're not there, then you're able to, speak right. And get that dispatched locally. Yeah. And then the other pieces that we kind of come in play is the shared calling routing policy. This is kind of the glue. This is the policy that you apply to your users so that, they use a specific resource account number or pool when they're placing the outbound calls. also lights up the dial pad in the Teams client without a phone number. And then the emergency call routing policy, make sure you know how your emergency call is going to get routed to the emergency services, and that it's matching the number that's being used, so you're not routing out the wrong trunks or paths. Baker, go ahead.
Yeah, it's a quick question. The shared calling policy, is that, can you configure that in TAC, or is it only available through PowerShell?
It's all PowerShell right now. So that was kind of that screenshot I was showing you, as a mock-up of kind of building out the policy where you have a resource account and you're saying what phone number the resource account has, what address the resource account's at, what is the pool of emergency numbers, and then what are the users that you're applying it to. That's all in PowerShell right now. But I find it interesting that it's been a while that that mock-up of the Teams admin center has been showing, and people think that it's there, but it is not available yet.
Right. Cool. Thanks.
And then the last piece is caller ID. So you can apply a caller ID policy to override, the display name. So maybe you want everyone to call out as a specific number, but then show maybe a company name instead of the resource account or whatever like that. So you can use caller ID policies to kind of curate what that caller ID looks like when placing normal calls. Of course, when you place an emergency call, any caller ID policy is disabled as well for that 60 minutes. And so it will show the display name of the person that placed the call, even though they're using shared calling. Okay, so let's jump into some PowerShell and kind of walk through how this works. So let me know if the resolution's okay on the screen. I can increase it a little bit. Let's see. So key thing here is that we need the latest PowerShell module. So you can just do a get-installed module Microsoft Teams. If you're not at 5.5 or just part of your habit, run the update module Microsoft Teams, no space. I'm running 5.8. That's the latest right now. After you have the latest module installed, you'll want to connect. I've already connected, so I won't run that, but connect Microsoft Teams, put in your admin credentials, and now you're connected into the service. Since we're in PowerShell, I'm just going to create my resource accounts through PowerShell. You can do this through the Teams admin center. Basically, I'm just having a standard naming convention, so I'm basically creating 3 resource accounts, one for DR, OC, and calling plans. And I'm using the auto attendant application ID because I'm going to assign these resource accounts to an auto attendant. So I just run those. Okay. So we have our object IDs. I'm just going to capture those because that's going to be critical for our shared calling policy. So that is DR. I'll just replace that here. We have OC. And then we have calling plans. Okay. So I'm just going to jump into the admin center. And I have a million windows open. 1 second. So all that step really was, and I'll just refresh. So all I did was basically create these 3 resource accounts. So if you were in the Teams admin center, you can go under voice, under resource accounts, and I basically just created these. And if we look at them and edit, you can see that they're their auto attendant type. So I just did it through PowerShell, but we can do it through the Teams admin center. Okay, and then so before we can use them, we need to license them. So if we go into the Microsoft 365 admin center, go under users, active users, we can see our 3 accounts. So we're going to just modify our licensing. We'll just replace. So we're going to put on our, if I can find it, Microsoft Teams phone resource account. So that's a $0 license. So we're going to apply that to all our 3 accounts. Key thing here is, making sure that your license usage is in the right location, specifically, for like calling plans or Operator Connect. But you should definitely do it for all types. So I have my calling plan account that's in Canada. Additional requirements again is we need that pay-as-you-go license, And in my case, I'm not using NCE, so I have my communication credits. So as we mentioned, for calling plans, we need these 2 additional pieces to make this account be used for shared calling. If we jump over to the auto attendants, and I'll just make sure I have one. So I have a shared calling auto attendant. Basically, it's a dial by name directory. So this is if someone does place a call, please say or type in the first or last name of the person you're trying to reach, does a dial by name directory. I could scope that directory, but in my case, I'm going to add resource accounts. And I probably licensed them too quick, but we'll see. So we have my calling plan resource account, my direct routing OC. So again, pretty much the same configuration for all of them, pending the kind of licensing differences. Okay, and we'll submit that. So if someone happens to call into those accounts, they're going to hit my dial by name directory. The next thing to get is we need that emergency address. In my case, I already know it's the 3rd address in Calgary, so I already know what my location ID is. But if you wanted to get that from the Teams Admin Center, we can just go under emergency addresses, locations, find one of your locations, or create one, and then it's going to show within that emergency address. So again, under the Teams Admin Center, voice, emergency addresses, this location ID, that's the ID we're going to need to make sure we apply to our phone numbers. Okay. So if we look at what we have to do from a direct routing point of view, so I have that resource account, that's for direct routing. I'm going to put the phone number, that's a direct routing phone number. I'm going to give it a direct routing type, and then my location ID. So this is probably something that you're not normally doing with your direct routing numbers. So I'm going to run that. And then that direct routing resource account needs a path to get out to the PSTN. So I'm going to run a online voice routing policy command. And then once that completes, I'm going to create my shared calling policy. So this says Canada direct routing. It has my resource account that I created, and then a pool of resource emergency numbers. So I only have one in my case. And it already exists. So let's give it a direct routing 1. And apparently I already have it. So let's just check what the account is. Oh, it already exists. Okay, so it's already configured. I probably ran this earlier. So you can see that we have the phone number, and we're just going to update the resource account. So let's do a set. And we'll just take out that 1. Perfect. Okay, so now if we look at the numbers, so this is the number tied to the resource account, no different than any other time. We have it basically tied to a voice application. We have our location ID for a direct routing number. But if we look at the emergency number, we're going to actually see the assigned person is actually the policy. So it's not tied to a user, it's not tied to the resource account, it's actually tied to the policy that's being used. So now when we apply that policy to a user, they're getting this phone number. So now we can have multiple people using this number versus, kind of the one number to one person kind of design. On Operator Connect, same thing. You would create the phone number assignment. So an Operator Connect phone number, make sure you're using Operator Connect. Make sure your emergency number is an Operator Connect number. Calling plans. For calling plans and Operator Connect, I had a strange issue where if I tried to assign the location ID of the number at the same time I was assigning the number to a resource account, it wouldn't take the locations assignment, and I couldn't adjust it after. So what I do is I always assign the number or location before applying the number to an object. So that was just a workaround I had to do. So if you ever have an issue applying the emergency number to a number already tied to a resource account, you have to unassign the number from the resource account, apply the location to the number, then you can apply the number back to the resource account. And from an enablement, it's pretty much the same thing. All we have to do is get our user, make sure that they're enterprise voice enabled. So we'll just make sure that we have an enterprise voice enabled. Oh, sorry, that was not the right command. Do this one. So this is my end user. It's going to have enterprise voice enabled, which means it has a phone system license. And then I'm just going to grant it a policy. So in my case, I'm going to give it a caller ID override policy. And then, hey, for direct routing, I'm going to apply that shared calling routing policy. So now this user is going to use whatever phone number was tied to that policy. And then for emergency calls, it's going to use whatever phone number is tied to that pool of emergency numbers. If we go into the shared or the caller ID policy, just going to go in here. What we want to do is then grab a resource account, and we'll just do SC, sorry, SC underscore.
Just while you're doing that, Michael, I think it's important to note, if you don't assign caller ID policy, it'll show the auto attendant name and number. So it's optional, as you indicated. So if you just want to keep things easier, you could just do that.
Yeah, I like to override with, like, say, company name or something, so that you are able to kind of control what that looks like for sure.
Sure. Unless the auto attendant you're signing it is the main number of that organization with the name already set, but sometimes it's not.
Yeah. And so now if we look in the Teams client, we'll see if the demo is on our side. So we'll just jump into this Teams client. So this is that shared calling account. We can see that we have the dial pad. So in real time, almost from on our demo. So we have the dial pad. We don't have a phone number. If I was to place an outbound call, I would use my caller ID policy if I have it, or I'd use the resource account kind of caller ID. So it'll be the resource account number, regardless of what it is. Someone calls back, it's going to go to my auto attendant that has a dial by name directory that can then hunt for this user. And then if I place an emergency call, it's going to grab one of the numbers in that pool for 60 minutes.
Very nice. So it all worked.
It all works, other than I had created the policy before we joined the call, so that was the only error. But pretty clean if once you understand all the pieces to kind of step through it. Much easier once it gets into the Teams admin center, because there is a lot of complexity of knowing, hey, we need the right phone number type. So a lot of error detection that you would probably would welcome in the Teams admin center. Like, hey, don't assign a number to the pool that's already assigned to a user. Make sure that the emergency numbers are the same type as the resource account numbers. So all these pre-checks, it'd be nice instead of dealing with red errors in the PowerShell.
Now, one quick
and
question.
You'll get errors like if there's no emergency address tied to the numbers, it will error when you try and create it. It'll say, hey, you need to apply an address to this phone number. So there is, detailed information in the error checking kind of on the PowerShell side, but you have to kind of interpret it and find where the error actually is within the kind of the error text.
And I assume in the call detail records, it shows all this, right? Like.
Yeah, so there's specific call outs in the call detail records that you're using shared calling. So in the calling plan report, as well as the call log for direct routing, there will be indicators that it's a shared calling user that's placing that call in and out.
That's good. All right, fantastic. Well, we'll wrap it up. Michael, that was a brave demo doing live PowerShell. Glad it all worked. Looks fantastic, and as we've said, I think this is a great set of capabilities especially for smaller to medium-sized organizations. So with that, thank you again, Michael, and we'll talk to everybody next time. Thanks.
Thank you.